Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that this is working. I can see the stream showing up now. So welcome to my very first live webinar. This is Constructive Clarity, Evaluation Without Shame. In case you don't know, I'm Katie Pepla, and I'm the founder of Thrive PhD, which is a supportive graduate student accountability community where we have weekly curriculums, daily accountability posts, all geared around the idea that grad school and academic life more broadly is something that should fit into your life rather than take it over. So I'm really excited to offer this webinar today. It's a topic that's been something that's come up continuously in Thrive and also in my own life. This idea that it's so hard to really get good data on yourself without sort of sliding into, oh gosh, I should have been better, I should have done this, I should have done that, and letting that shame of what could have happened stop you. So I put together this webinar as the first sort of pre-lesson to a new course that is launching tomorrow called Jumpstart. Jumpstart is a 4-week program to help get a stalled project moving forward. It's not just for graduate students, it's for anybody who really identifies as a person without enough time, but it's definitely made for the academic in mind. So without any further ado, there is a chat channel along the side. I'll be keeping an eye on that as best as I can. I've barricaded the door so that none of my 4 cats can come in. And if it's all right with you, I'm going to go ahead and share the slide presentation, and we'll get started. Okay, so today is constructive clarity, or the idea that there can be evaluation without shame. Self-evaluation is what I have in mind, more the idea that you can get your own data on yourself. You don't have to be beholden to what your advisor thinks, what your boss thinks, what your PI thinks, that you have the space to sort of evaluate for yourself and start to make changes to move into the direction that you want to go into. So the cycle that I really want to break is this thing that I'm calling the shame cycle. I see this all the time in my clients. I know that I can do it myself, but it starts with the idea that you are, or you're feeling like you're off track. You're not getting done what you need to, you're worried about time, but whatever the reason behind it is, you feel like you're kind of off the rails. This usually leads to people not wanting to take a deeper look at their behavior. If I just work harder, everything will fix itself. If I figure out just how to get that week back, how to make up for that lost hour, that lost month, I won't have to do that sort of deeper look. I know that I can just work harder and catch up. So instead of really getting to the root of what's going on, you just work harder or you avoid your work altogether. This leads to some sense of shame. We all know the feeling of shame. I think it's part of the human experience, but it's definitely part of the academic experience that you've been given this privilege. You have the chance to work on what you want to. It's a passion project. Somebody's paying for it. You're paying for it in all sorts of material and immaterial ways, and you feel shame for being off track. Which then leads to the fact that you don't want to course correct. You don't want to really do anything to get back. You just sort of keep doing what you're doing in the hopes that things will return to normal, that you'll come back to a balance, that the ship will right itself, that as soon as this thing is turned in, you'll be better. As soon as this class is finished, you'll get back to a more healthy schedule. But if you're never making changes to kind of correct the things that may have gotten you off track in the first place, this cycle just repeats. You feel more off track. You feel more avoidant. The shame gets worse. You're still not correcting anything. And on it goes into a deeper and deeper spiral. The way that I know to counteract that is evaluation. And then to be clear, I don't mean the kind of evaluation that your supervisor will give you. I don't mean a formal performance review. I mean evaluation in a more general sense. Can you take a look at what's going on? Can you start to get data on yourself and then use that to make evidence-based decisions? So for me, the secret sauce to really balanced, productive, feeling aligned, feeling steady is this idea of frequent, low stakes evaluation. So frequent, it happens often, it's built into your routine, it's something that you expect. It's low stakes, there's no one sort of evaluation point that's gonna make or break you because you do it all the time. So you make smaller changes, you course correct more gently to move even closer to the direction that you want to be going into. So it's the idea that we don't need to come to a full stop and then do a radical life turnaround to restart a habit. You can check in with yourself more regularly, feel less of urgency about those check-ins, and then use that data to move yourself forward. So on the agenda today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of evaluation. So what do I mean by evaluation? How can you do it? This idea of data collection, so getting data on the on yourself, your big academic experiment. Third, we're going to talk about lowering the stakes. So what are some strategies that we can do to take some of the emotion out of this evaluation and make it a more dispassionate experience? And then I'll kind of conclude with talking about how to fit this into your schedule, how to add yet another thing into what I'm sure is already a jam-packed agenda for your day, for your week, for your month. Okay, so first, the mechanics of evaluation. So what do we mean by it? How do we do it? And the first is, what areas can I look at? In your whole life, you've got lots of things on the table. Your work, your academic identity, your professional identity is just one of those areas. So the first thing that I would say in terms of what areas can you look at is zoom out. Be able to develop the skills, develop a framework to see your work as one part of a bigger wheel. When I see clients, often they feel, rightly so, there's lots of structural and academic reasons that you can feel like this, that grad school is their life and everything else needs to sort of fit in and around that. And from what I know, it doesn't get any different once you land the job or once you're on the job market, or even once you get tenure. Academic work and the sort of intellectual production that we all do can take up more and more of that pie. So being able to see that as one slice of a whole life instead of big chunks that everything else has to fit around. At Thrive PhD, we have a tool called the Wheel of Life, which I will be sending out to everybody who's registered on the list today. But it divides an academic life into different areas. So it's not just work and then everything else. It's research, it's teaching, it's service, it's professional network, it's professional development. Being able to see all of those areas as separate, but part of a bigger whole is a really helpful tool. And so then the third thing is to kind of say, okay, so I've zoomed out, I've decided that I'm a whole human being with a whole life. I've given some names for different areas that I might want to evaluate, and then I need to get specific. So take, for example, your research. And by this, I mean something really broadly as the sort of work that I am producing as an academic. Whether that's a bench science work or a humanities manuscript or an article for a journal, sort of whatever. But inside of that category of research, there is something, so inside of research, you might really want to focus on your writing. And then inside of writing, which is also this really big category, you can sort of say, okay, am I struggling with gathering sources? Am I feeling really overwhelmed by the process of making an outline? And so, for example, you might say, you know what, I have really hard time moving from a rough draft that I produce really quickly to a polished manuscript. I get really frustrated with that endless iteration, all of those comments, all of that feedback, and I lose myself and my work and my motivation in this endless revision process. That's much more specific than saying, ugh, nothing about my academic life is working. Being able to really drill down and identify which parts aren't feeling well, which parts of the process are feeling like they're out of alignment, can really help give you a more focused place to start. Then it comes down to, what do I look at when? As anyone knows who's ever had a sort of job with a performance evaluation cycle, you don't get a huge, massive annual review every month. That's why they call it an annual review. It happens once a year, which the idea is that gives you time to sort of take that feedback, process that feedback, make a plan, experiment with it, identify any problems, course correct, and then hopefully move towards the goal. So I would say that you need to set a cadence for how often you're going to do this overall. I'm going to look at my whole life and evaluate everything. I don't like to do it any more than once a quarter, every 4 months, or every 3 months rather. Any more than that, it feels like every month I sit down and I question my entire existence. I'm hopeful that when I feel a little bit more secure about what's happening, things in my life settle down a little bit, I'll be able to slow that cadence down. I'll look every 6 months or maybe every year. But the more frequently you do these big picture evaluations, what am I doing and why am I here, big existential questions, the more destabilizing it can feel. So the bigger the evaluation, the less often that you should do it, in my opinion. So, but then when you're looking at this kind of more frequent evaluation, pick 1 or 2 focus areas, 1 or 2 of those wheels on your, or slices on your wheel. Maybe I'm going to focus on wellness and professional network for this month. Instead of saying, I'm going to overhaul my research, my writing, my professional network, my teaching, my wellness, and my finances all this month. The more you can sort of narrow, the more you'll be able to really dig deep and see some progress. The third thing is, how are you able to look at your goal progress? What ways do you make that concrete to yourself? There are so many steps just in a writing process, from I have the idea for the specific manuscript to it's published in a journal. So are you monitoring your progress to any one of those milestones? Are you looking, do you have somewhere that you can easily say, okay, the next step is I need to collect all my sources. The next step is I need an outline. So the first level of sort of tracking your progress on these goals is to say, okay, here are my milestones. This is the next one. This is where I am in the overall project life cycle. The next place I would really start to look at is your weekly routine. What things do you do every week? What things do you schedule yourself into? What things will you always get done no matter what? But one of the places that we can really start to see goal progress, or the ways that we're moving towards these areas that we want to focus on, is in where we're spending our time in a little bit of a bigger chunk than just the day. Because in the day-to-day, I would say really focus on your habits. What things are you doing every day? What things are habitual? What things are you doing and making space for that you don't have to decide? I always use the example of brushing your teeth. Hopefully you're not at the point in your life, or at least your dentist hopes that you aren't, where you're deciding twice a day whether it's worth it to brush your teeth. It's something that you do habitually. You get up, you brush your teeth. You get ready for bed, you brush your teeth. You're not deciding if it's important. You're not deciding if your teeth are dirty enough to brush. You're just doing it. And then reevaluating these focus areas. So say you've done your month focus on wellness, and maybe it's feeling more stable. Do you have points in your schedule or in your kind of routine where you regularly stop and say, okay, how did the sustained focus in this area work out for me? And how how do I move forward from here? Do I need to keep focusing in this area, or can I move on to something else that might be on my mind? Okay, so that's the kind of mechanics of zooming out and saying, okay, what are the things that I can even start to evaluate? And then the next step is data collection, which is one of my favorites, but I'm a nerd. So I'm really big on the idea that we need to start making evidence-based decisions, especially when it comes to evaluations we do on ourselves. So emotions can make evaluation harder. Anytime that you've ever received feedback from somebody in person that you weren't expecting, especially if it's tough criticism, you'll know that that makes it harder to hear that message. It makes it harder to move forward. There's an emotional recovery process that has to happen when the ego gets bruised that way. And so if you can take some of the emotional weight out of this process of evaluation by doing it yourself, by doing it in a way that feels supported and sustainable, you can take some of that emotional charge out to make better decisions. Because at point 2, I think it's important to, and this should say evidence to counter, not evidence, but evidence to counter the experiment. Or support your findings. So do you have evidence, data that you can point to that you are making the right calls in terms of what you're doing with your time every day, what you're doing with your focus every day? The more evidence you have, the more you can really start to feel that the choices that you're making in that area are based on something. They're not just a wild goose chase. They're not just something that you read on the internet that's worked for someone else that might help for me. It's moving towards this idea where I'm using the evidence of how I'm spending my time that I'm collecting on purpose to start making my decisions. The third step is to start designing experiments. I love experimenting on myself. I do it all the time. But rather than saying, I never have the time to work out, I really want to work out. Designing an experiment that says, okay, I'm going to track how my mood and focus and production in my writing goes when I work out in the morning 3 days a week. And I'm going to run this experiment for 2 weeks. And then I'm going to evaluate whether it's worth it to get my body up and out of bed and into whatever physical exercise that might be before my start time. But rather than just saying, I'm going to blindly start working out in the morning and hope that that helps, being really purposeful about saying, this is the variable that I'm isolating, these are the effects that I'm going to monitor, and this is how long I'm going to run this experiment for. And then you can adjust what you're doing and when based on that evidence that you collected, not your emotions. So in that exercise example, I would tell you very honestly that if we were going by my emotions about how I feel about getting up to work out in the morning, I would never ever do it. I hate it. I am very grumpy. You don't want to meet me on my way to my 7:30 workout class. But I have reams and reams of evidence that I work better, I work more focused, I am more rested, I sleep better when I work out in the morning. And that if I wait and just hope that I will feel like working out at 4 or 5 or 6 p.m., I more often than not skip it. So I have evidence to counter my emotional feeling that no one should be up before 7 a.m. and putting on workout clothes. So I can adjust what I'm doing based on that data and not my emotional state. So here's another example. Time management is the #1 thing that clients in Thrive and that see me personally really want help with. And what I often hear is this really emotion-laden statement. I have horrible time management. And so the first step is to sort of reframe that and say, okay, what's my hypothesis? My hypothesis is that my time allocation during the day does not match my objectives. Another way of saying that is I'm spending my time on things that don't move me forward in the way that I want to move forward. So that very first step of saying this isn't something that's wrong with me, it's not something that's objectively horrible or objectively amazing, it's just that the way I spend my time doesn't match where I want to move forward. So even in that first step, we're really trying to reframe it away from a judgment about your self-worth as a person. Okay, so you have this hypothesis that you're not spending your time in a way that matches up with what you want to do. So you design an experiment. First thing you'll need to do is track your time. So there's a program called Toggle that's free, where you sort of click a button when you start something, and then you click a button when you end something, and it'll automatically count out how long you work. You can do it really analog with just a time log, where you say, okay, I started this task at this time, I ended it at this time. Or you could even go back at the end of the day and block out things in your Google Calendar. From this time to this time, I was moving. I was commuting. From this time to this time, I was working out. From this time to this time, I was grading. So that's step one. Get data on where you're actually spending your time, minute to minute. Step two, compare your to-do list, so the things that you set out to do during the day, with your done list. So what I mean by a done list, and I recommend this strategy to anyone, even if you're not running this specific experiment, is make a list at the end of the day of what you actually did get done, and be really specific. I answered 7 emails. I got started on that course design that I was working on. So even if you have this sense that you didn't do anything that day, making a list of what you did actually get done, and then looking at that side by side with what you plan to do, can be really sort of revolutionary. And then at the end of, say, a 2-week experiment, compare your done list with your time logs, and then your goals for that 2-week sprint. So did you spend your time on the things that you got done, or did you spend your time and not get things done? And how did that match up? So how did that allocation match up with what you said you wanted to do in that 2-week period? So then you start to look at trends. Okay, and these are all trends that absolutely are real for me. When I started to do this experiment and really pay attention to my time, I noticed that when I start my day with writing, which is one of the most popular pieces of advice for any academic writer, get up and write in the morning. When I do that, I struggle inside of the writing session, and I get less done throughout the whole rest of the day. So not only is that hour where I started my day trying to write without doing anything else before that a really unpleasant 60 minutes, it also has effects the rest of the day. When I started that way, I was less efficient. I spent more time on Twitter. But conversely, if I start with my email in the morning, I'm really efficient. I can knock out all of those open tasks and then sort of feel more empowered to get through whatever's left on the rest of my thing. But when I start my email in the afternoon, it's totally inefficient. I'm not focused. I'm not giving it my best. I'm crafting really long, unnecessary responses. So email for me works way better in the morning than it does in the afternoon. And then what I spend the biggest chunk of my time on is what I call a B-list task. So an A task is something that needs to get done today, or there will be severe consequences. A B task is something that would be great if it happened today. So I spend the majority of my time on things that it would be great if I got them done, but they're not my biggest priorities. And it's normally because my biggest priority things feel a little bit more stressful. They feel a little bit more touchy, a little bit more vulnerable. I just don't want to do them. So I am very efficient at knocking out all of the things that would be great, but aren't as important as some of those other things. So these are all trends that I wouldn't have seen if I wasn't really taking the time to log and track my time. So then I can start to say, okay, what are the decisions that I'm going to start making in my life based on this evidence that I have? That I'm going to do my email in the morning. I know I'm supposed to, quote unquote, start my morning with writing. I don't like it. I don't want to do it. So I'm going to do my email in the morning when I know I'm efficient at it. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time in the last hour of the day responding to anything else that came up that really needs my attention. But I'm not going to spend my meat of the day, so to speak, dealing with emails as they come in. And instead of writing in the morning, I'm going to write in my peak brain time, which is later in the morning after I've had some coffee. So it's not first thing. I've had a few wins under my belt, and then I can sort of settle into a more deep focus time. And then I'm going to really build in systems that help me be mindful about the fact that I'm working on B tasks. So I'm going to leave my to-do list with the most important things of the day open on my desk so that I can see it. I'm going to check in with myself at lunchtime and say, okay, what's still left on the A list? What can we do to make sure that we get that? And then I'm going to repeat my experiment for 2 weeks. I'm going to say, okay, if I do these 3 things, do I get more done? Do I hit my most important tasks more regularly? Am I matching my time allocation with what I'm doing? But instead of just sort of saying, oh, I have terrible time management, I'm going to read 72 blog posts about academic time management and pick the most appealing strategies from all of those and try them willy-nilly. I've really tried to isolate the variables and make evidence-based decisions, because not everyone's advice is going to work for you. Not everyone's schedule is going to work for you. And this is just one example. It's also true in your wellness, in your financial decisions, in your professional network. You have to vet other people's advice with what does or doesn't actually resonate with you in your life. Okay, so here is the real meat of what I have to share with you. I really think you've got to lower the stakes on the evaluation. Anybody who's ever been evaluated by their boss knows that outside evaluation is tender, it's vulnerable, it really kind of can knot you up inside. But it doesn't have to be that way when you're the boss of you. It can really be a time to experiment, a time to play, a time to get to know yourself better without the idea that if this experiment doesn't work, I will never become a productive academic writer and therefore I will fail. It doesn't have to feel like that. It can feel a little bit looser. It can feel a little bit more playful. And here are some ways that I think that you can start doing that. Okay. So evaluation, when you're doing it, is a lot like getting into a very cold pool. And so the whole thing is you got to get acclimated to it. Moving into a lifestyle or even a working pattern where you're evaluating more regularly is a cold pool if you're not used to it. You've got to get acclimated to it. So there's 2 types of people, and I honestly think that there's no right way to do this. But some people, and this person usually is easily overwhelmed. They might be a little bit more anxious. They want to start slowly. And so this is somebody who gets into a cold pool by easing in. You put in 1 foot, and then you put in 2 feet, and then you put in 2 shins, and then you put in 2 thighs. And it might take you an hour to get into the pool, but you've done it in a way that's not a shock to your system. So for this person, I would say pick just one focus area. Don't try to evaluate everything all at once. Don't try to completely overhaul your life in the next 2 weeks. Just pick one area, and then when that feels comfortable, widen that out to 2, and then repeat it. But really move slowly, because otherwise you can feel really sort of unmoored if you're taking a look at everything in your life all at once. However, there is also a second kind of person, and I will be honest that I am a type 2, that I like to just jump in. And so these are the people that jump into the cold pool. They're just going to jump in, and it's going to take their breath away. It's going to literally seize up their whole body. It can feel really unmooring. It can feel really overwhelming to start looking at everything. How is this working? How is that working? So if you're going to open up your focus and really start to move into a more evaluation-based lifestyle in all of these areas at once, give yourself a little bit longer time to acclimate. It's going to feel really uncomfortable for a while. You might need to just sort of grin and bear it as your body gets acclimated. But if you do better with a big sudden change that you mark with a bit of ceremony, which is how I tend to do better, that can definitely work too. But either way, you have to really focus, I think, on this idea that acclimating to a new way of paying attention to your working style and your living style, really, take some adjustment. And the more that you can give yourself some space and some grace to make that adjustment, the more powerful these tools will be. Okay, so my other secret weapon is mindfulness. And in this way, mindfulness is often talked about as yoga, as meditation, as and it is all of those things. But in this, I'm really focusing on the idea that mindfulness is just paying attention to how you're feeling and what you're thinking, as close to the minute in which you're feeling and thinking those things. So another way of saying that is just being present with what you're thinking and what you're feeling as you're thinking and feeling them. This is talked about in a lot of different literature as the witness stance. So you're a witness to your own mind and your own body. But I like to think about it as sort of a scientist mindset. So a scientist will go into a lab and they know that they are not, even though it might feel like it sometimes, they're not their samples, they're not their experiment. It's their job to sort of stand apart from that experiment and gather the data and make the discoveries. So the idea is that you observe first and then you evaluate second. So you might decide that you really want to focus on your teaching. You feel like your teaching skills are really far behind. You feel really unmoored. So you start to build in observation to collect some data. You have somebody come in from the Teaching and Learning Center to observe you. You have your faculty advisor observe you. You collect some evaluation tools from your students. But before you jump to a conclusion about how good or how not good of a teacher you are, you observe it first. And that's really what I mean by the scientist mindset, that you're not prejudging the experiment before you run it. And then the third point underneath this sort of mindfulness banner, and I could talk about this forever, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end, is the idea that you can disconnect this sensation, whether it's a mental sensation, a thought, a physical sensation in your body, or your emotional sensation from who you are. So the phrase that I keep in mind all the time is, this is what I'm feeling. This is not who I am. I'm feeling really frustrated with this writing project. I'm not a bad writer. I'm feeling really stuck with my job options. That doesn't mean I'll never be employed. So really kind of separating how you're feeling minute to minute from your core sense of who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. And so these are some reframes that I think are really helpful, and they've been really helpful for me as I've started to incorporate more and more evaluation. So the first one is, without this data that I'm collecting, I would be trying random strategies to fix a problem I only understand in broad strokes. So this is the reframe that I use when I get really overwhelmed with all of the things that I'm tracking in my life: my sleep, my steps, my words per minute, how fast I'm editing, how fast I'm doing web design. I'm collecting a lot of data on myself all the time. I try to narrow it down so that I'm only focusing in a few areas, but I try and tell myself when I'm feeling that overwhelm that if I wasn't collecting that data, I would just be taking random things that I read on the internet about how to be a faster writer or how to be a better writer and throwing them blindly at a wall and seeing what sticks. So with the data, I can make more evidence-based decisions. I can feel more empowered to be in charge of who I am and what I'm doing and what it's working and what isn't. Otherwise, I'm just sort of guessing in the dark. And I know from understanding how the scientific method works that often the more data you have, the more refined your hypothesis can be, the closer you are to getting an answer, which in this case is the closer you are to finding strategies that really work to get you where you want to be. Point 2, I'm doing something that's uncomfortable because I believe what I'll find is helpful. So anybody who's really sat down with a coach in a new group, in a new course, and really dedicated themselves to trying to do something better, trying to do something in a new way, knows that it is uncomfortable. It doesn't always feel good to try a new thing, and it doesn't always feel good immediately. And I think that for a lot of academics, there can be this feeling that I understand intellectually what the problem is, but I'm not implementing it directly into my life. And that's very frustrating, because if I understand it, I should be able to do it immediately. And there is this really uncomfortable space between, I know this is the direction I want to work in, and yet I'm getting derailed. So how can I sort of be comfortable in that uncomfortable space? And for me, I remind myself that I'm doing something that feels uncomfortable because I believe what I'll find will help me. And this really comes down to understanding the stakes of what you're evaluating in a more gentle way. So if you want to be a better academic writer, rather than framing it in a really intense, I need to be a better writer so that I can get a job, so that I won't be penniless, starting to reframe that to say, okay, I want to be a better writer so that people can understand my work, so that they can find my work, so that they can find me and I can add to the conversation. And I'm doing this uncomfortable new writing routine and evaluating it every day, even though it's uncomfortable, because I believe that what I'm going to find is going to be helpful to me to reach that ultimate goal of being able to communicate better. All right, 3. Life is more like a spiral than it is like a straight line. And so feel free to shout out in the comments if you've ever felt like, oh, I found the perfect routine that made me so productive that one semester. There was this magical moment where my class schedule lined up, my commute was perfect, my fitness was amazing, I was eating great, everything was great, and I felt like I totally hacked my whole working routine. And then something changed and it all fell apart. And now I have to start, not even at the beginning, but at the beginning with this whole sense of shame that I used to be so good at this and now I'm not. And I have to start and rebuild this whole system from the beginning. And I would call that some straight line thinking. Unfortunately, and this is as big of a bummer to me as it is to anybody else, we don't always have total control over what happens to us, right? You might get a totally different teaching schedule the next semester that is alternate times that you hate. You might suddenly become a caretaker for a family member that you weren't expecting, and you have to dedicate 20 hours that you don't have to that endeavor. You might need to move for a partner's job or for your job or for a family reason and have to rebuild all over again. And if you are holding this shame that I used to be so good at this, I used to be so good at managing my time, or I used to be so good at making time for my writing and now I can't, it can feel even harder to do this sort of experimenting. So instead of thinking that all of these areas that we're evaluating are problems that we can identify, evaluate, find a strategy, and then fix once and for all, moving into more of a spiral pattern, that there's always going to be seasons where it feels easier. There are always going to be seasons where it feels harder. But it's not a failure to have to reevaluate. It's not a failure to say what was working before isn't working now, and I'm going to really have to try to adjust and do this in a new way, because I do need to do this, and the way that I was doing it before just isn't going to work now. But that doesn't mean that I have failed. It just means that it was different then and it's different now. So seeing it as some of these problems you might work on for the rest of your professional career. And that can be something that's really hard to wrap your mind around. Like, I might always have to really keep an eye on how often I move my body physically, because it doesn't come naturally to me, but I know it's important. So this is something that I'm just always going to have to keep an eye on. But if you accept that, this idea of you're always going to have to check in with yourself, you're always going to have to say, am I doing this in a way that makes sense? Can make each one of those evaluation points feel easier, and each one of those new strategies that you try, a tool in the tool belt that you can say, okay, in a semester that sort of looked like this is what I did to make time for my writing. How about if I try that again, even though it's not something I've had to use in a while? Instead of saying, the way I used to make time for my writing doesn't work anymore, therefore I'll never find time in my schedule to write ever again. So those are some of the reframes. You're going to find your own. I know that you will. But if you can believe that this process of finding places you want to focus on, trying a new strategy, evaluating how well it works, and then making a new decision to move forward, if you can kind of say that this is just part of the process for me, it can feel less like an evaluation of how you're doing as a human on this big stakes, like heavy stakes scale, and more like this is a way to check in with myself and make sure that I'm spending my precious resources, my time and my energy in a way that makes sense. Okay, so the metaphor that I use for this is the kayak versus the cruise ship. So if you've ever seen a cruise ship try and turn around, it's brutal. It's a big ship. It weighs a lot. It takes a lot of energy to turn that around, as opposed to a kayak, where you can make one stroke on this side and suddenly you're on the other side of the lake. But the more often that you're paying attention to how you're turning, the more often that you're doing these sort of course corrections, the easier they can feel, the more nimble you are, the more able to adjust to a disturbance, a wave, so to speak. So sometimes you're going to be a cruise ship. Sometimes it's just going to be a hard stop where you have to put all of your energy into turning around. But hopefully the more you've built in these places to check in and see how things are working, the more you can feel a little bit more like a kayak. Okay, so the last point that I want to make sure I get to is, okay, I'm with you, Katie. There are all these strategies that I can try, that I can use. I know that I should pay attention. I just don't have the time for it. You are outlining hours I don't have. And I feel you. We're all busy. We all have these packed schedules. So here are some ways to kind of make time for this process. So starting from the big picture, set aside every quarter a couple of minutes, an hour in a coffee shop to do the wheel of life, or to do whatever high-level evaluation tool that works for you. Say, okay, I'm going to spend this hour with this latte and this donut and really take a minute to check in with myself. And I think I can find an hour once every 3 months. And then maybe building in something on a monthly level. Can I build some time in around the first of the month to identify the 2 or 3 areas that feel most out of balance and make a plan to move forward with them? And then saying, okay, on this week-to-week level, can I set aside a little bit of time on Sunday night, on Monday morning, on Monday afternoon to identify my weekly power items, that these are the things that deserve my best focus, my best hours, my best effort. And then moving it into your day-to-day routine, saying, okay, I sit down at my desk, or maybe it's what you do when you leave your desk for the end of the day. What are the most important things to do tomorrow? What are the most important habits that I really want to put my effort into? So if you know that you're really trying to establish this working out habit, saying, okay, I'm just going to make it a priority that my gym clothes are clean and that they're on the floor ready for me to put on in the morning, so that it's one less thing that I have to do. But identifying on a day-to-day level the 1 or 2 things that you're really going to feel good if you make time for them. So you don't have to have an hour every day to sort of evaluate, because the more often you're checking in on all of these levels, the more it becomes a habit. It becomes a way of thinking about your day, about your week, about your month. So there's lots of ways just on like an activity basis to add this evaluation into your routine. I believe strongly in planners. That's why I'm making one. More plugs to come, I guess. But the same thing you can do with the to-do list on a Post-it note or with a bullet journal that you really love to use your pens in. Do you have some moment, whether it's with an app or with a Post-it, to say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm focusing on, as opposed to just showing up at your workstation and putting out the fires as you see them? I would really encourage you to have a start of the month routine, that when the calendar rolls around, and this way you're not beholden to an academic calendar, it doesn't matter. June 1st is June 1st for everybody. So you say, okay, on the 1st of the month, I sit down for 20 minutes and I set aside the 2 or 3 things I'm going to focus on. Maybe you build in a quarterly retreat. And it would be great if we could all go to Bali or to Mexico and spend time every 3 months doing this sort of deep focus. I like to just know that every 3 months I take an hour and I go to my favorite coffee shop and I get a cookie and I get my latte and I just sit with my journal and I look at my wheel of the life, at my objectives, at my goals for that quarter. And it feels special and it feels set aside because I have that cookie. But it means that I don't have to radically alter my routine in order to make that happen. And as soon as I'm done, I can move into my emails or my writing or whatever else is happening. Maybe you consider doing New Year's resolutions. Maybe there's semester resolutions. I like resolutions, but as I said, I'm a resolution type person that I like having a big goal that I wrap around. But this is something that you have a lot of cultural and social support for. Lots of people make resolutions. Lots of people understand that mechanism. And that's one of the ways where academic life isn't that much different from a professional life for anybody else. So yeah, finding ways and activities that make sure that evaluation gets into your routine can be really helpful. All right, so we've come now to the idea that I have a course, and feel free to log off if you don't want the pitch, but there's a course that I have called Jumpstart that opens up tomorrow. And this is kind of the first pre-lesson because I really believe that you can't make any meaningful, sustainable changes without taking the time to kind of really look into where I was before and what I was doing and what isn't working so that I can hone in and really target my efforts instead of blindly trying strategies. So this is a 4-week class. It's just 35 bucks. It's all online. It's totally asynchronous. You can do it when you want to, new lessons every week, but it's focused on getting you started in a sustainable, shame-reduced way. So rather than making you rub your nose in the mess that you feel like your writing routine or your manuscript or your research is, evaluating it with a little bit more clarity and then saying, okay, this is where I want to get started. Here's how I can move it into my routine in a way that as soon as this course is over or as soon as that next big hurdle comes up, it's not all going to fall apart again. Or if it does, I have the tools to get back in. So you can always find me on Twitter and on Instagram at ThrivePhD. We do have a website. And let me just stop sharing my screen and welcome you back to my face and say that I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Feel free to throw them into the comments, but I really appreciate you joining me. Evaluation is one of those skills that I feel like other people at some time got taught and I was never taught them. And so I had to kind of cobble this understanding together through 2 parts therapy and 3 parts self-help books and then 6 or 7 parts experiment. So I'm always happy to share what I know in the case that it might help people. I see that Michelle said that she really likes how this is getting rid of the idea that there are things that we're just supposed to do every day. And yes, if there's one lesson for you to walk away from this is that evaluation gives you the evidence to say, good for you, not for me, which is the most powerful professional phrase that I have found yet. Good for you, not for me. And if you have the data to sort of back up that that strategy doesn't work for you, it can really help you feel empowered to design the life that works the best for your particular set of brain chemistry and likes and dislikes and schedule. So I will give it a second to see if there's any questions. Again, I'm happy to take any emails. Make sure you're signed up for our mailing list if you'd like to learn more about Jumpstart. The links are all over the Katie Peplin Coach Twitter and also the Thrive PhD Twitter. But I thank you all so much for joining me, and I hope that you have a really good last day of May, wherever this might find you. So thank you so much and have a great day.